Every dominant system begins the same way, not with force but with efficiency, not with conquest but with coordination. A method emerges that is so effective it appears neutral, even benevolent. It lowers costs, smooths chaos, rewards discipline, and quietly outperforms everything around it. At first, no one resists it. Resistance would be irrational. Participation is profitable. Opting out feels irresponsible. Over time, the method hardens into structure. Structure hardens into dependency. Dependency hardens into inevitability. History shows this pattern repeating with unnerving consistency. From ancient trade networks to imperial taxation regimes, from medieval guild monopolies to modern financial architectures, the outcome is always the same. What begins as an improvement becomes a constraint. What begins as freedom becomes enclosure. What begins as choice becomes compliance. The system does not need to threaten. It does not need to persuade. It simply becomes the environment in which all decisions are made. Those living inside it rarely notice the shift. Life continues. Commerce expands. Innovation flourishes, but only within the boundaries the system allows. Alternatives slowly disappear, not because they are outlawed, but because they are no longer viable. The system becomes too large to challenge, too efficient to replace, too interconnected to escape. This is not a story of villains. It is a story of incentives. Systems do not persist because they are loved. They persist because they align individual survival with systemic obedience. They reward those who adapt and quietly exhaust those who do not. Over time, the distinction between participation and existence erodes. To live within the economy is to live within the system that organizes it. Every historical example ends the same way. Concentration increases. Complexity deepens. Control becomes abstracted. Decision-making moves further from those affected by it. And when stress appears, whether from scarcity, competition, or internal contradiction, the system does not bend. It tightens. The mechanisms designed to stabilize it amplify its fragility instead. What makes these systems truly powerful is not their ability to dominate, but their ability to disappear from view. They stop being perceived as structures and start being perceived as reality itself. People stop asking who built them, why they were designed this way, or who benefits most from their continuation. The system becomes invisible precisely because it is everywhere. By the time consequences emerge, they feel natural, inevitable, as if no other outcome was ever possible. This documentary is not about a man in the traditional sense. It is about the creation of a system so efficient, so deeply embedded, that it outlived its architect and reshaped the economic landscape long after his name faded from daily conversation. A system that did not need to be enforced because it made enforcement unnecessary. Once such a system is complete, escape is no longer a dramatic act. It simply ceases to be an option. Large-scale collapse rarely arrives the way it is imagined. It does not begin with riots in the streets or the fall of governments. It begins quietly, inside the economic engine itself. Long before institutions fail publicly, they fail privately. In incentives, in balance sheets, in the invisible math that governs behavior. In functioning systems, effort is rewarded proportionally. Productivity feeds stability. Risk is priced honestly. Capital flows toward value creation rather than extraction. Collapse begins when these relationships invert, when access becomes more valuable than contribution, when scale matters more than efficiency, when survival depends not on producing more, but on positioning closer to the center of the system. This transition unfolds in stages, almost always in the same order. First comes innovation. A new method organizes resources more efficiently than what came before it. Costs fall. Output rises. The system expands rapidly, attracting participants who benefit from its advantages. Second comes consolidation. The most efficient actors grow faster than the rest. Scale compounds. Smaller competitors disappear or are absorbed. Power concentrates justified by performance. Third comes dependency. Markets, workers, and institutions adapt themselves around the dominant structure. Alternatives shrink, switching costs rise. Participation becomes less about preference and more about necessity. Fourth comes distortion. The system grows so large that preserving it becomes a priority over improving it. Financial engineering replaces productivity. Debt expands to sustain growth that no longer comes naturally. Signals that once guided decision-making become unreliable. Fifth comes extraction. Wealth still moves through the system, but less of it remains within the productive base. Value is pulled upward and outward, away from labor, innovation, and long-term investment. Consumption rises even as underlying productivity stagnates. Sixth comes denial. The system appears stable because it is familiar. Complexity masks fragility. Risks are normalized, explained away, or deferred. Those who benefit most insist the structure is sound, while those who feel strain lack the leverage to change it. Finally comes irreversibility. At this stage, reform is technically possible, but practically unattainable. Any meaningful correction threatens collapse, so corrections are postponed. The system continues, not because it works, but because stopping it would be worse. Collapse, when it arrives, is not a single event. It is a recognition. A moment when participants realize the system no longer serves its stated purpose and cannot be reformed without dismantling the very mechanisms that sustain it. What makes this pattern so persistent is that each stage is rational from within the system. No single decision appears catastrophic. Each choice makes sense in isolation. It is only in aggregate, over time, that the trajectory becomes clear. These stages have appeared in empires built on land, on trade, on credit, and on industry. The materials change. The logic does not. And once a system reaches the stage where participation is mandatory and alternatives are unviable, the identity of its architect becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is who understood this pattern early enough to build not just a company, but an economic environment around it. That understanding would define the next century. The Roman Empire did not collapse because it was invaded. It was invaded because it had already collapsed internally. At its height, Rome was the most sophisticated economic system the ancient world had ever produced. Roads, ports, standardized law, and a common currency allowed goods, labor, and capital to move across vast distances with unprecedented efficiency. Productivity surged. Trade expanded. Wealth accumulated. For centuries, Rome's system worked because it aligned expansion with discipline. Conquest funded infrastructure. Infrastructure enabled commerce. Commerce reinforced political control. But scale changed the equation. As Rome expanded, administration grew heavier. Armies became permanent rather than temporary. Borders lengthened. The cost of maintaining the system began to outpace the value created at its edges. Instead of expansion funding stability, stability required constant expansion. When expansion slowed, the system turned inward. Monetary distortion followed. To meet rising obligations, Rome debased its currency. Silver content declined, not dramatically at first, but consistently. Prices rose. Confidence eroded. The currency still circulated, but it no longer signaled value accurately. Economic decisions became harder. Long-term planning gave way to short-term survival. Debt, once a tool, became a crutch. Taxation increased, but it fell unevenly. Small landowners were squeezed out, absorbed into large estates that were politically protected and often tax-advantaged. Productivity declined even as consumption among elites increased. Wealth moved through the system but increasingly failed to remain within it. It pooled at the top and drained from the base. The social consequences were gradual but profound. Free labor was replaced by coerced labor. Innovation slowed. Military recruitment suffered as economic opportunity narrowed. Citizens disengaged from civic life, not out of apathy, but because participation no longer yielded security or advancement. By the time external pressures mounted, the empire's economic core was already hollowed out. The system still functioned, but only through force and inertia. Its complexity masked its weakness. To those inside it, Rome felt eternal. To those managing it, every solution made the next problem worse. What ultimately failed was not Rome's power, but its incentive structure. The system rewarded proximity to authority rather than contribution to productivity. It punished independence and normalized extraction. Once those incentives were locked in, reversal became impossible without dismantling the very mechanisms that held the empire together. When Rome fell, wealth did not disappear. It moved. Networks persisted. Elites adapted. But the system that once coordinated an entire world fragmented into smaller, less efficient structures. The environment Rome had built could no longer sustain itself. The lesson is not that large systems collapse quickly. It is that they collapse long before anyone admits it. And when they do, the architecture that once made them unstoppable becomes the reason escape is impossible. This pattern did not end with empires of stone and silver. It reappeared centuries later in systems built not on land or legions, but on belief. In the early 20th century, the global financial system convinced itself it had evolved past history. Industrial output was rising. Technology was accelerating. Capital moved faster than ever before. Economists spoke confidently about stability engineered through expertise. Risk, they believed, had been tamed by modern finance. This was not Rome, they said. This time was different. It never is. In the years leading up to 1929, credit expanded far beyond underlying productivity. Debt was no longer merely a tool for investment. It became the engine of growth itself. Households borrowed to speculate. Corporations leveraged to inflate returns. Banks extended credit based not on income, but on rising asset prices. Confidence fed on itself. The structure looked sophisticated. Financial instruments multiplied. Balance sheets grew complex. Risk was dispersed, or so it appeared. In reality, it was concentrated and obscured. Signals that once disciplined behavior, savings, cash flow, real demand, were replaced by optimism and leverage. Denial set in early and persisted long. Warnings were dismissed as outdated thinking. Productivity statistics were selectively interpreted. Market corrections were framed as healthy pauses rather than structural fractures. Each intervention designed to sustain confidence deepened dependence on the very mechanisms causing instability. When the system finally turned, it did so with brutal speed. Credit froze. Asset prices collapsed. Institutions that had appeared invincible failed within weeks. The problem was not panic. Panic was the consequence. The cause was a system that had mistaken expansion for resilience. What followed revealed the true nature of late-stage systems. Losses were socialized, control centralized. New rules were written to prevent repetition, but the core incentive structure remained intact. Size was rewarded. Complexity was preserved. Dependence increased. The belief that this time is different was not a mistake of intelligence. It was a mistake of position. Those closest to the system's center benefited too much to question it. Those harmed earliest lacked the influence to stop it. By the time the pattern was obvious, reversal threatened collapse, so continuation became the default. The stages repeated precisely. Innovation gave way to consolidation, consolidation to dependency, dependency to distortion, distortion to extraction, denial delayed recognition, irreversibility locked in the outcome. What changed was not the pattern, but the scale. These systems no longer governed empires or markets alone. They governed daily life, employment, savings, survival. And as they grew more abstract, they became harder to see, harder to challenge, and harder to escape. Which brings us to the modern era, and to a man who understood earlier than most that the ultimate form of power was not ownership of resources, but ownership of the system that moved them. By the late 19th century, the United States was not yet an empire, but it was becoming a system. Railroads stitched the continent together. Industrial output exploded. Markets that had once been local became national almost overnight. Oil, in particular, transformed from a novelty into a necessity. It powered lamps, factories, transportation, and eventually, warfare. Whoever controlled oil did not merely control a commodity, they controlled the pace of modern life. John D. Rockefeller understood this before almost anyone else. He did not set out to dominate oil production alone. That would have been fragile. Wells ran dry. Prices fluctuated. New discoveries disrupted old fortunes. Rockefeller instead focused on the part of the system that never slept: refining, transportation, finance, and coordination. He built a structure that absorbed volatility rather than suffering from it. Standard Oil did not simply outcompete rivals. It reorganized the entire industry around itself. Through scale, vertical integration, and ruthless efficiency, it lowered costs so dramatically that participation became rational and resistance became ruinous. Independent producers could sell to Standard Oil, ship through Standard Oil, insure through Standard Oil, or be priced out of existence. This was not monopoly as brute force. It was monopoly as environment. Railroad rebates ensured preferential access. Centralized accounting optimized margins across regions. Predatory pricing punished defiance temporarily and rewarded compliance permanently. Over time, oil did not move through markets freely. It moved through a system designed to make deviation economically irrational. The brilliance of Rockefeller's model was that it aligned individual incentives with systemic dependence. Workers were paid reliably. Consumers enjoyed lower prices. Investors received stability. Regulators, at first, saw efficiency, not danger. Each participant benefited in isolation, even as collective autonomy eroded. When public backlash finally arrived, the system was already mature. The breakup of Standard Oil did not dismantle the architecture Rockefeller created. It formalized it. The pieces remained interconnected through finance, supply chains, and shared logic. Control dispersed on paper while coordination persisted in practice. This is the critical distinction. Power did not vanish. It diffused into institutions, norms, and expectations. The oil system became inseparable from the broader economic system. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and defense reorganized themselves around energy abundance, governed by centralized coordination. From that moment on, modern economies no longer asked whether they would depend on large systems. They asked only how deeply. Rockefeller did not trap the world in oil. He demonstrated how to build systems so efficient that escape no longer made sense, until dependence itself became the risk. And that logic did not stop with oil. It became the blueprint. Late-stage systems rarely feel fragile from the inside. They feel optimized. By the time a structure reaches full maturity, instability has been engineered out of daily experience. Supply chains run smoothly. Credit is abundant. Institutional language emphasizes resilience, oversight, and control. Volatility, when it appears, is treated as an anomaly rather than a signal. Each intervention to reduce risk adds another layer of complexity, another buffer that distances cause from effect. This is the acceleration phase, the period when deterioration speeds up precisely because it is least visible. Institutions begin to prioritize continuity over function. Metrics are adjusted to preserve confidence. Narratives replace signals. Risk is no longer eliminated. It is redistributed downward and outward, away from the center and toward participants with the least capacity to absorb it. What once would have triggered reform is now normalized as the cost of stability. Warnings emerge, but they lack force. They come from outside the system's core or from inside voices framed as pessimistic, outdated, or irresponsible. The system does not silence them. It absorbs them, reframes them, and moves on unchanged. At this stage, denial is not ignorance. It is strategy. What accelerates collapse is not a single shock, but the cumulative weight of small distortions left uncorrected. Incentives drift further from productivity. Debt expands to sustain expectations built in a different era. Complexity increases faster than understanding. The system becomes so interconnected that meaningful reform threatens immediate disruption, so postponement becomes policy. Participants sense something is wrong but lack a clear reference point. The system still provides, it still rewards, it still punishes deviation. Stability feels real because daily life continues uninterrupted. And because the costs are distributed unevenly, collective action never quite materializes. This is why late-stage systems often appear strongest just before rapid deterioration. Their control mechanisms are fully developed, their narratives are refined, their dependencies are complete. There is nowhere outside the system from which to apply pressure. When change finally comes, it feels sudden not because it was unpredictable, but because it was structurally delayed. Rockefeller understood this dynamic intuitively. He did not build a system that needed to be defended. He built one that defended itself by making alternatives economically untenable. Once that logic becomes embedded across an economy, collapse does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, as acceleration. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because systems reward the same behaviors, generation after generation, regardless of who occupies them. John D. Rockefeller did not invent greed, control, or consolidation. He recognized something more enduring. He saw that the most powerful form of dominance was not ownership of assets, but ownership of incentives. Not command, but architecture. Not force, but dependence structured so deeply that participation felt voluntary long after alternatives disappeared. Once a system reaches that level, morality becomes irrelevant. Good intentions cannot correct it. Bad intentions are no longer required to sustain it. The system persists because it aligns survival with compliance and stability with continuation. Individuals operate rationally within it, even as the collective outcome becomes increasingly fragile. This is why history's most consequential systems rarely end with villains exposed or lessons cleanly learned. They end with reorganization, with continuity under new names, with fragments of the old structure recombined into something familiar enough to trust and complex enough to resist challenge. Power shifts form, not function. Rockefeller's true legacy is not oil or even industry. It is the demonstration that once a system becomes efficient enough, it ceases to be questioned. It becomes background. And when a system becomes background, it becomes destiny. Collapse, when it comes, does not arrive as punishment. It arrives as consequence. Not because people were foolish or malicious, but because incentives were left intact long after conditions changed, because systems built for expansion were asked to deliver permanence, because control scaled faster than accountability, because complexity delayed recognition until choice narrowed into inevitability. The pattern is not unique to any era. It is not confined to empires, corporations, or financial regimes. It emerges wherever coordination outpaces resilience and efficiency, outgrows adaptability. Wherever success hardens into assumption, wherever stability is mistaken for sustainability. Understanding this does not grant immunity. Awareness alone has never stopped a cycle, but it does restore perspective. It reminds us that systems are built, not ordained. That inevitability is usually a matter of timing, not fate, and that the most powerful forces shaping the future rarely announce themselves as threats. They present themselves as solutions. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history, and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.